So, picking up where I left off, slight interruption there. The notice that the assumption here is that men and women, men and ladies, as it's termed on the doors of the restrooms, that means white. Nobody has to say white men and white women. It's just ladies, gentlemen, or ladies and men, and everybody knows that means white. Well, that's a default. The other thing to notice, of course, is that there are separate bathrooms for male and female. Again, this is long before our times now, where we are sharing that space in different ways than we did back then, where people who identified as men and people who identified as women had separate bathrooms. But for African Americans going to that restaurant or going to that gas station, they would have to take twice as long if they had a family of, say, 4 with 2 male and 2 female members. Then, clearly everybody would have to use that same bathroom, and it would take twice as long to do it. Or the inconvenience, the potential embarrassment if somebody was already in there and somebody of a different gender came in, et cetera, et cetera. You don't need me to spell it out entirely, but it's just, half the number of bathrooms means twice the amount of time and inconvenience. Slide 5, I try to spell out what some of the institutions are that we're talking about when we're talking about institutional racism, and I include mythology and its symbols, government, politics, and law, the economy, which means production and distribution of goods and services, education, art and literature, architecture, music, film, traditions and artifacts and customs and beliefs and creeds, and language. What is valued as language, what is devalued as language, what is characterized and mocked as language. All of those things are matters that are institutions in any culture, any society. The last one, Weltanschauung, is a worldview of life. It's the way that the world is perceived by a culture at any given time or any given place. Think about how each of those institutions, from education to law to government to politics to entertainment, all of those have raised bars against people of color throughout the centuries. They've raised bars against women as well, quite frankly. And those positions of power and influence determine so much of what goes on, where the money is, and who has the power, that it's important to see and think about how each of those might represent, again, not like the Fisher investment ad. Nobody's killing or murdering anybody necessarily in any of those, but the deprivation, the lack of economic investment in particular communities, or the opportunities that certain people would have, the access to the law, all of those things have racial overtones in our culture and in our history that need to be addressed. Slide 6 is, in some ways, to me, the almost most unbelievable of all the slides. It shows the quote-unquote many varieties of human beings. And again, this idea of race as being a thing is not historically that old. It really begins in the 1500s, early 1600s, when Europeans began going to Africa and needed a justification for enslaving people of color in Africa and bringing them essentially to the New World to raise crops such as sugar cane, later tobacco and cotton and other crops, but primarily sugar cane. And you had this triangle, of course, that you've all read about, from Africa to the Caribbean to the U.S. colonies. And the U.S. yet, they were the European colonies in the New World. And that triangle grew over time, and that slave trade grew over time to be a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in today's dollars. You needed a justification for all of that, and in order to justify enslaving other human beings, you needed to tell yourself that those other human beings were not equal to you. You needed to say that they were inferior to you. And so this new project began where Europeans primarily, began to characterize people around the world in certain categories by perceived differences in skin color, by perceived differences in eye shape, by perceived differences in hair type and place of origin and so forth. And of course, with everything else, you create a hierarchy. And so it's really important to look at these two images in terms of how they're arranged on the page. The one on the left is a collection. I'll hold it up here. It's going to be this one. Is just a poster that attempted to group human beings in various categories based on, again, these perceived racial differences. At the very bottom of it, you can see it says race types. Well, at the very top, the top of the page, the most powerful position on the page is a white man, identified as Anglo-Saxon. Now, there's nothing scientifically different between what they list as an Anglo-Saxon person and what they list underneath him as a Russian person, or as to his lower right, to his right, our left, a Scots Highlander. Those are all people that would be categorized as white. But notice that there's, even within the category of whiteness, there's this attempt to create a hierarchy, and the Russian guy and the Scotch guy are underneath the Anglo-Saxon guy. This thing is as bad as a piece of Nazi propaganda, essentially, where take out the words Anglo-Saxon and stick in the word Aryan, and you'll get the point. Grouped around in a circle with again the white guy at the top. Notice there are no women either in any of these images because man or males are the default throughout most of human history in terms of the way people think and organize their thinking. Around him in a circle are ever less qualified, if you will, from that perspective, people of, again, different origins, different places on the planet. And then there's a distinct line drawn with a Japanese guy on the right and a Chinese guy on the left. And then underneath them, again, and this is all arranged as a hierarchy. This is not an accident. Somebody sat down and said, how am I going to design this page? None of this is random. So don't think, oh, it just happened that way. No, somebody did this. This is a designed thing. Somebody designed it, somebody approved it, somebody put it in a book. That costs money, and nobody's throwing money out the window for just randomness. Arranged underneath those two Asian groups, Chinese on the one hand and Japanese on the other, and we all know, of course, there are many more people in Asia than Chinese and Japanese, but why pay any attention to anyone else? Whoever did this had to account for the fact that those were highly complex societies. In fact, China is the oldest culture in the world. It's about 5,000 years old, continuously running culture on the planet. Europeans had to account for that somehow. How is it that these people that we consider inferior could be, equal to us in so many ways, in terms of their development and industry and blah, 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 blah. So they get a sort of special placement on the page. Well, they're not quite us, but they're better than all of these people underneath. And all of those people underneath are Native Americans and Aboriginals and other people. And then at the very bottom, African people people of African origin, not African Americans, but African people nonetheless. That's horrific enough. What's to me even more horrific is the image on the right-hand side, which is from a textbook from the 1950s, where again you have the hierarchy very clearly, and you have to think about this. How is this page arranged? Design matters. A white man at the very top, obviously a very blonde white man, and then as you go down through the Mongoloid, which was basically Asian, all the way at the bottom you find actually the Australoids, the Aboriginal people of Australia, that end up at the bottom of this particular hierarchy. But this is what would be called a cultural default hierarchy, where those that are considered to be at the top are placed at the top. And again, that's institutionalized in the publishing world. We know that none of this is true. And the next slide, slide 7, gives you a couple of quotations that actually race doesn't exist as a thing in the scientific understanding of race. We are 99.9% genetically the same, all human beings. There's more variety in a group of pigeons than there are in a group of human beings in terms of genetic differences. So these old categorizing, this last image shows, again, a hierarchy reading from right to left, as we do in the Western world. Who comes first? The Caucasian guy, and then they're all guys, moving all the way over again to the Aboriginal Australian people. The next slide just shows that even within a group of people, in this case Indians from India, there is this hierarchical arrangement as well. That's slide number 8. You can hear my dog, who has running dreams when he's asleep. He's woofing and chasing a rabbit in his sleep. The next slide, again, I'm not gonna do the bad thing of reading the slides to you, because everybody knows that's bad form. But these are a couple of quotations from another podcast called Scene on Radio, SCENE. It's a pun. But it was a whole series that this guy, John Buin, did on race. And John Buin is a white guy, but he did this whole series, this whole podcast series on race, and interviews a number of very fascinating people on it. And that's the source of these quotes. Slide 10, same thing. But one thing to think about when you look at slide 10, and this quote I will read to you, there's an idea that people have talked about that you can have racism without individual racists, because systems and structures have been set up in a way that they just run this way on their own, and that's a perfect description of institutional racism. You benefit from institutional racism if you're white, even if you say and believe and follow to be true that you aren't a racist. And we've all heard white people say, I don't have a racist bone in my body. I'm the least racist person, in the history of the world, and that may or may not be true. But what is true is that if you are a white person, generally you benefit. I used the example this morning talking to my wife. I can walk my dog anywhere and not worry about getting arrested. I can go to Stewart's anywhere wearing a hoodie, and nobody's going to follow me around assuming that I'm there to steal stuff or that I have a gun and I'm going to hold the place up. My friend Myron, who's African American, lives in Yonkers. He had a gun drawn on him by a police officer when he was merely out walking his dog. Why? Because there had been a robbery in one of the apartment buildings nearby. Now, why they thought a mid-50s African American guy out walking his dog might be the person who had just burgled somebody's apartment is beyond me. Yonkers is a very mixed community. I have white friends who live in Yonkers, and I have black friends who live in Yonkers. And, they weren't rolling up on some white guy. just the idea that somebody my age, Myron is one of my college roommates, that, I've never had a gun drawn on me. I mean, I just don't have to worry about that. That's just not something that's ever going to happen to me. And, regardless of what I wear, where I go, it's just, I've benefited from being white my whole life. And if I'm not honest about that, then I'm part of the problem. And people that deny that, people that say, oh, no, that's just baloney, generally have white skins, and they've never had to worry about those things. Not everybody's life is the same, and not everybody's had the privileges that I've had, white or not white. And I'm, fully aware of that. But it's really important to keep in mind the privileges that you carry along with you with a white skin, things you never have to worry about, that people of color have to worry about. So those systems and structures, those are the institutions that we're talking about, those sorts of things. Slide 11 is a little hard to digest. It's from Inside Higher Ed, which is an online higher education journal. But what it shows from right to left to right is the overall numbers of people of various racial groups in higher education, and moving across Asian, Black, Hispanic, and white, and then how many of those are never enrolled in college, how many started in one place, how many completed college in a different place, and the numbers, are reflective of not only the institution of education, but how those demographics shake out over the 2.8 million college students when this was done in, I think, 2017, I just saw the date. The other big institution, where are they if they're not in college? For many African Americans, of course, that is prison. And we all know that far more African Americans are in prison than any other racial group. They represent 33% of the prison population. White people, on the other hand, even though it's a vast majority, 64% of the population of the country is white, only 30% of the inmates in prison are white. So it's a 2-to-1 flip-flop when you look at it. Actually, more than 2-to-1. African Americans are vastly overrepresented in prisons. Hispanic people, somewhat, but not as much. A lot of this, of course, we know is due to different responses to drug enforcement. The same amount of crack and the same amount of powder cocaine can get very different sentences. We all know this, but also the number of random drug stops, the number of people who had a small amount of marijuana on them who happened to be white that were given an appearance ticket, versus the number of African American young men who end up in jail and ultimately in prison due to drug charges that are vastly differently enforced across our culture. Part 2, how did we get here? And I'm going to fly through these slides actually, because a lot of them are clickable links. The first one is a brief interview. You just click on the YouTube link and it'll take you to this brief interview of Nell Irvin Painter, who wrote a book called The History of White People, and she explains where the word Caucasian came from. It's kind of funny. If you don't know it yet, your hair will curl. The next slide, again, very texty slide. I'm not going to read through it because that's bad form. I'll let you read through it. That's slide 15. Slide 16, the same. Very texty, and you can read through that on your own. Slide 17, the same. Part 3, American chattel slavery. That's slavery, trade, and enforced labor. Just a couple of things to note here. First, the image of the slave ship. I'm sure everybody's seen this in a history textbook at some point in their life. But think of the arrangement. Again, things are designed purposely, for a purpose, for a reason. Whoever designed the first slave ship did it that way, for a purpose, for a reason. It was to essentially get people used to what enslavement would be. Every moment of your day, everything that you do is completely under the control of somebody else, including how you lie, how you sleep, and everything else. Think of how the bunk rooms in Auschwitz were designed. Somebody, architect, had to design those buildings. Construction workers had to build those buildings. Land had to be acquired. Sewer lines had to be laid. Roads had to be built. It doesn't just happen. These things are purposely done by other people to enslave others. One person to note, in 1640, John Punch, who was an African indentured servant, actually wasn't an enslaved person. He and two European indentured servants escaped from their servitude. The conditions there were awful, and they decided they'd run away. Only John Punch, the African, was given a life sentence of slavery. He was no longer an indentured servant. The European guys were let go after a while. They had extended time in indentured servitude for sure, but they eventually had their freedom. But John Punch, the African, did not. So there was, a little unequal treatment there. More slides with a lot of text, so I'll let you read the text on those. Slide 21 shows us Carl Linnaeus and Johann Blumenbach. Blumenbach is the guy who's referenced earlier as being the person who came up with the concept of Caucasianism, so you get a picture of him. Post-enslavement of black people, part 4, and you'll notice that I haven't mentioned Native Americans at all yet, but there's an image there. Native Americans as a minority group are the people who've been in this hemisphere the longest, and they were the last group to get the right to citizenship. That is citizenship when you're born in the United States. 1924, the Indian Citizenship Act. Of course, that meant that they finally got the right to vote. Last week, we had our first cabinet-level appointee of a Native American person. Deb Haaland is now the Secretary of the Interior, a very important position historically. That is the agency that oversaw the reservation system in the United States. I've had a long and fraught relationship with Native Americans, and so that's a real moment for our country. The man in the middle is President Calvin Coolidge, looking very uncomfortable in that image. Leaping forward, well, again, hierarchy, and this is slide 25. No dogs, Negroes, or Mexicans. So dogs get primary space over Mexicans, and of course that's meant to be funny in somebody's sick sense of humor. But it's really distressing that somebody would actually make a sign like that, sell a sign like that, hang a sign like that, on their door, over their establishment of business, whatever. Those are, again, decisions people make. These are not accidents. It doesn't just happen. Somebody chooses to put a Confederate flag outside their door. Somebody chooses to put hate speech on their Facebook page. These are not things that happen by accident. I mentioned with the Native American Citizenship Act, 1924. In 1922 and 1923, there were two cases that went to the Supreme Court with two men who were seeking to become naturalized American citizens. Takeo Ozawa, who was Japanese by birth but moved to the United States, lived here for more than 20 years, and Bhagat Singh Thind, who was a Sikh from India. Both men argued all the way to the Supreme Court to try to be allowed to become naturalized citizens, and we're not allowed to. So the year before and the year before the year before, the citizenship of 1924, two Supreme Court cases ruled against these two minority people, both, of course, from Asia originally. The next slide, 27 and 28, we actually did a little bit on last week, and this is our national literature. What I didn't include last week was the Norton Anthology of Literature, which is the Bible, if you will, of college anthologies, has been for a long time for American literature. Excellent series, I use them. When I was in college 30 years ago, very underrepresented African Americans, women writers, people of color. We were just beginning to consider thinking about those things, but very little was actually being done at the textbook level. And again, what gets put before us as our national literature and put before the world as our national literature, this is who we think of ourselves. This is the default, again, that we've been talking about. So Norton's been improving vastly over time. Finally, slide 30 is a discussion of redlining, which was a practice that was embedded in law, and it was who got to borrow money, get a mortgage, which is the reason I'm actually talking to you from my house. If I were African American and it was the 1950s, I would probably not be talking to you from this house. Well, it didn't exist then, but you get the point. That a person like me, if I were African American, would not have been able to get a mortgage, not because I didn't have a job, but because of the color of my skin and because of the racist assumptions built into the system. For most Americans, our houses are our wealth. I don't have much money in the bank. I've never been good at saving, but for a whole bunch of reasons, I don't have a lot of money in the bank. But I have a lot of money in my house. My house is worth, $350,000. We only owe $80,000 to pay yet on our mortgage. So if my wife and I were to sell this house, we would probably ask around $400,000. We would probably get around $360,000, $375,000, I would guess. Once we paid off our mortgage, we would have, say, $280,000. Free and clear. We could do that with that whatever we wanted to. That would be our money. If you've been paying rent all your life, you don't have that. If you've been kept from buying a house in a particular area, if you don't have the wealth, or if you can't find a lender that will give you a mortgage, even if you make the same income as me or more, then you don't have the ability to invest in that way. Then you don't get something out at the end. If you've been renting your whole life, you have nothing to show for it. You have no wealth. You've been paying somebody else's mortgage for them by renting that space. Think of that. If you own a building and you rent out the spaces in that building, you need to rent them out at a rate that will at least pay your mortgage on that building. Otherwise, you're losing money, and there's no point in owning the building, right? It's the same. So if you are a renter, you are paying somebody else's mortgage and their taxes, and their utilities. And you're getting nothing in the end. When you move out, you're going to get, a thank you, hopefully. But you don't get any money back. You don't have any, you invested nothing. You've got nothing back for it. And that is the case for so many people of color throughout the history of the United States. They live in a house they'll never own. They live in an apartment they'll never own. They live in a condo they'll never own. They live in rented space, and it's partly because of redlining historically that people of color, African Americans in particular, were not able to purchase. More disparities of wealth on slide 31. And then slide 32 and slide 33 back to Fisher Investment. And I have no bone to pick with Fisher Investment. It's just that I kept noticing that they were a very white bunch for a very long time. And the slide 32 shows, their top 5 guys, and they're all guys, they're all men, they're all of a certain age, and they're all white as me. Slide 33 is there are 2 links there to 2 new Fisher Investment ads. So they've been updating themselves over time. The last few slides I'm not going to go through because I'm done. Look for another lesson on probably Wednesday. I will post another lesson, Wednesday or Thursday. This one, the next one being much more tied directly to Toni Morrison. So with that, I'm going to go walk my dog. And it's a beautiful Saturday, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. And weather's supposed to be getting nicer and warmer as we go. So I will see you soon. Or I won't see you, but you'll see me.